Hey, Anne, do you have any plans on April 28th or April 29th?
I actually do, Ruby. I am going to be a speaker, which is like one of my favorite things to do.
Oh my goodness, me too. I'm going to be at the Seattle Reproductive Symposium.
That is where all the hip healthcare providers are going to be this April. So if you are one of our many listeners that is a provider, we want to share with you the opportunity to get in on that early bird pricing. Up through March 27th, you can sign up at a discounted rate, and it is such a great thing to give to the community.
That's right, and it's up to 11.5 AMA Category 1 credits, and there will be 5 of our previous guests from our podcast speaking. So Dr. Nicole Barker, Dr. Sarah De La Torre, Judy Simon, Laura Hayden, Kristen Chambliss, among many, many other wonderful guests.
And we have some hands-on workshops. So the Thursday before, there's an ovulation planning workshop, and that Saturday afternoon, there's a workshop all about doing IUIs or intrauterine insemination. So if you are a healthcare provider either in the Seattle area or interested in coming to the Seattle area in April to meet us, find the full agenda, register. Everything's online at seattlereproductivesymposium.com, and we are accredited and hosted by Seattle Reproductive Medicine.
Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in.
Welcome back to the Whole Pineapple Snack Edition. We are so fortunate to welcome back Ellen Trachman. Hopefully you listened to her full episode, and hopefully you were so inspired you went back and listened to some of her podcast episode, I Want to Put a Baby in You. I forgot to ask you in the fall, how did you come up with that title?
My husband came up with I Want to Put a Baby in You. We thought it was funny, and then realized later that maybe some people didn't fully take it seriously, but it's okay. You know, we still enjoy that there's some humor.
I love on your website, it says, if you're uncomfortable with TMI and talking about the birds and the bees, this is not the podcast for you. I'm like, oh, I love that. We get along great.
Yeah, I just say you're probably not listening to our podcast either if you're uncomfortable with those things.
Not.
So
my sister, so her child always listens to the podcast. So she's always like, it's pretty safe for children, mostly. I mean, her child's a teenager, so there's that.
Well, we went into dipping the surface of some of the legal challenges in the main episode, but we wanted to save the snack to talk specifically about people that already have like embryos frozen, and how worried do people need to be post the Dobbs decision, and if they need to like try and ship their embryos to states that have more reproductive freedom.
What are we supposed to do?
It is a great question, and I can tell you that like many things that if you ask, 10 different attorneys, you'll get 10 different answers, and a lot of it's trying to predict the future, or not knowing, since there's so much uncertainty right now. I will say I wrote on the topic shortly after the Dobbs decision, the question of should we be moving our embryos? Because I was getting a lot of clients who were asking that exact question. And my inclination initially was like, let's not panic, let's not overreact. But honestly, the more I was researching and the more I was like digging into various topics and areas, and especially the movement by those who were anti-abortion that were clearly indicating that they were anti-IVF and that they felt life begins at fertilization, my concerns grew greater, and I was, seeing more and more issues. So I will say, not to panic people, but I have a lot of concerns, and I'm a little bit frightened for the future in many areas. And I think that it will likely be state to state, depending on your level of rights when it comes to reproductive services generally, right? That we're...
Well, I know you mentioned in the main episode, Louisiana, and gosh, I've already forgotten it. What was the fancy word?
Oh man, I was going to use that. Yeah.
Ooh, you're gonna use that today.
Yeah.
Juridical persons. Yes.
Juridical person. That special status, because that's been a law for a decade already?
Yeah.
So what have people already been doing in Louisiana if they were done completing their family and didn't want to use embryos?
I feel like Louisiana is an example of maybe arguing don't panic, right? That we have already had a state for many, many years that had a law that says that embryos are juridical persons and that you're not able to discard or destroy an embryo. They must be used for reproductive purposes, either for yourself or donation to others for reproductive purposes. And we've seen that there still are IVF services in Louisiana, but it has meant that for those with embryos remaining once they've completed their family who may not want to donate them to others for reproductive purposes, they did have to move them out of state to have additional options in terms of what they could do with the disposition of those embryos. So if anything, that's like kind of a good note that, even if there are states that are very restrictive, then likely you'll still have possibilities of moving embryos to a different state and have choices at that point. And maybe you don't need to move them right away.
I guess the hard part is, but what if they pass a law saying you can't ship embryos out of state? I mean, you're already seeing issues with this in terms of people prescribing medication pills. So what is the limit that a state can say about, especially if an embryo has rights, because there are already rights about not being able to, if you have custody battles, travel across state lines and that kind of stuff. So it's not inconceivable that you, if you're trying to protect, could say that you can't move out of state just because of that. Although would you have warning? Would you kind of know that this is coming down the pipeline, or could a state just kind of pass a law?
Well, yeah, and just thinking about Louisiana itself, I used to think, and I'm not a lawyer, precedent means something. But now with the Dobbs decision, I'm like, well, clearly not all the time.
I think that's the thing that is the scariest when it comes to IVF, access to fertility treatments, is that the basis for Roe and the right to reproductive access of termination of a pregnancy is the same. There was these privacy rights. I mean, that's not true. There's definitely different arguments about whether they're grounded historically, and there are there differences. But, we see in the Dobbs opinion, specifically Justice Thomas, who calls out that all privacy rights, all rights based in privacy in substantive due process should be reconsidered. And there are a lot of rights on those grounds that people in the United States have come to depend on and rely on. So Obergefell is one of those decisions. It's on privacy rights. So the right to, as well as the right to consensual sexual activity, that states shouldn't be regulating sodomy laws, for example, as well as contraception. But there's been case after case in the IVF and embryo field that were based on these rights of privacy and the rights that we have seen in the Constitution as the right to reproduce or not reproduce. And the scariest thing for me is that post-Dobbs, I think all of those decisions, the precedent is questionable. Would they have gone the same direction now? So one especially concerning law is this one out of Arizona. So Arizona passed a law a few years ago that says that any couple going through a divorce in Arizona that has embryos, the judge is not permitted to look to what the parties may have agreed to at the time. They can't look to the consent form or an agreement between the couple, but the judge must award the embryos to the spouse most likely to bring them to birth.
Wow.
And the opposite of what we've seen for years. It used to be that you had this, you couldn't, use without the consent of both people.
Absolutely, right? Because of this, understood right in the Constitution to have the right to choose to reproduce or not to reproduce, which that right not to reproduce was very strong, right? That someone couldn't use your genetic material against your wishes. And the Arizona law clearly goes against that. And I think 7 or 8 months ago, any attorney in this area who did not predict the future would have said that Arizona law is unconstitutional. It's not consistent with these rights to determine your own ability to reproduce or not reproduce. And it's just a matter of time until that law in Arizona is overturned as unconstitutional.
Well, how can you even protect yourself? If whatever you say at the beginning doesn't matter, we just, in our past episode, we're protect yourself, do all these things up front. But if you do all these things up front and then in the end, like the judge can't even look at that. That's
right. Exactly. That's what I was going to bring up. I stopped
just don't
myself
have
from bringing it up in our prior part when we were talking, because that's exactly right. That, you're signing these consent forms and they are very important, but they can only do so much, especially when there is contradictory law. And the thing that kind of like blows my mind too, right? We're talking about Arizona, but say you create embryos with someone in Washington and the consent form says upon divorce, they're discarded, or, no one can use them against the other one's wishes, but you really want to use them. So you move to Arizona, you establish residency, you file for divorce. Are those embryos yours? Probably.
Well, even to go back to Louisiana, like, wasn't that the whole Sofia Vergara case, is that her ex sued in Louisiana on behalf of the embryos, even though the embryos had never been to Louisiana? Like, weren't they created in New York? But
yeah, Los Angeles, I think. But yeah.
Oh, Los Angeles,
yeah. So in that case, I mean, her ex-fiance, Nick Loeb, was determined to have access to those embryos and to be able to use them for conception purposes, despite the consent forms indicating very clearly that neither could use them without the other's consent. And Sofia Vergara did not want him using the embryos, and he became very public and, wrote a New York Times article about his daughters and needing to bring them to life. And he brought multiple suits against her in federal court and state court in California, and losing on multiple fronts. He then sought a jurisdiction that might be more friendly. And I think he bought property there, or like tried to set up residency there and establish a trust. But that case was ultimately dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. Wow. But it would have been very fascinating, right? What if the embryos had been formed there?
Well, it's changed how we counsel too, at least for me. I don't know, Anne, if you've changed how you've actually been counseling people when it comes to like egg freezing versus embryo freezing for a while, having that discussion very specifically. Like, one thing to really think about when you are deciding eggs versus embryos is once you have embryos, you're tied to another person.
Oh, actually, that was my thought. I think the hard part for me is I can emotionally, I do see the arguments both ways, because especially before we had egg freezing, you have these really sad cases of, women with a cancer diagnosis, wanting to preserve fertility, boyfriend at the time, or even spouse making embryos. And then if he changes his mind later, being unable to use those embryos. And those were heartbreaking cases. And I see that.
And to be fair, the case that led to the Arizona law was very heartbreaking and was very sympathetic. So that was Terrell v. Torres. And Torres was an attorney. She was diagnosed with cancer and she had a current boyfriend. And as noted, it only recently has egg vitrification become close in, statistically having as good a chances as forming embryos. But a mere few years ago, their high recommendation medically, was you want embryos formed. So she turned to her boyfriend naturally to say, would you provide sperm so I can preserve my fertility and have these embryos form? And, the case is fascinating because he said no initially. And she looked for other sources, and apparently an ex-boyfriend said, I will donate to you. And only once the ex-boyfriend volunteered did he change his mind and decide, oh, no, I will donate to you. No, I will provide the sperm for these embryos, which is terrible. Like if she had just gone with the ex, right? Yeah. But then sure enough, after going through cancer treatment, these being her only options to have a genetic child.
And no longer having fertility. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to make those decisions so quickly with cancer treatment.
Yeah.
Like it's not like you can think about this for months. Usually your oncologist is telling you, sometimes you have a little time, but most of the time your oncologist is saying like, you need to have this consult with a fertility provider. You need to get this done so we can move.
I'll give you like 2 to 4 weeks and then we're starting. So
right.
Yeah.
You need to do it now. And then we're starting your therapy.
And what is so heartbreaking in this case, especially, is on those consent forms, they had checked in the case of divorce, donate to others for conception purposes. So they married and then divorced. And when she had no other option to have a genetic child but these embryos, the answer was her genetic embryos had to be donated to others. So she could not have a genetic child, but someone else could.
Oh my gosh. You can't try and use them.
I seriously just got chills on my back. Man, see, it's like, it's not black and white.
I mean, so in those cases, please talk to an attorney. Like, please, if you're going through cancer treatment, make sure you have rights, or just freeze eggs. Just freeze eggs.
I've probably talked about it more in some of our other providers when people come in, and I mean, it's like, if you're not actively trying to get pregnant in this moment with this person, even if you think they're going to be your life partner, like, creating embryos opens up all these extra scenarios. And especially with the change in the law, what if 5 years from now, like, nobody needed to use them, but you do have to, there could be regulations that we don't even anticipate right now. And it makes everything more complicated. And it's not to say that there's not the possibility of some sort of legal status for eggs or sperm, but our bodies are losing eggs and sperm all the time. And so embryos have historically been seen a little differently, both morally and legally, although not legally as much as they are now.
For sure. So please just freeze your eggs. You can combine them with your loved one's sperm or eggs later, just for now, keep it separate.
Well, and also just the moral part too, I feel like a lot of people don't think about in the moment, but sometimes even if you in the moment don't think you're going to like really see embryos differently, sometimes you do feel differently once you're a parent. And like, maybe it doesn't seem as easy as it once did to discard embryos the way you thought you once would. And then you end up in this situation of, am I okay with donating them for someone else to use? And so things are often sort of similar in the first episode where you talked about how people might not think they want a no-one relationship. If you think about how becoming a parent really changes how you feel about all kinds of things. And just like, when you have a child that's donor conceived and then they start asking you questions, you might wish you had more of an open line of contact to get those answers. I think you might think you don't want embryos, or, you'll just discard like it's nothing, and then you might feel differently.
Or maybe the donor thinks, oh, I just want to help someone and give this gift. But the donor isn't thinking like, hey, down the line, I might have a family. I might have children. My children may very much want to know if they have genetically connected siblings out there. That might be very important information to them.
And what's fascinating is the fact that these kinds of things have like always been out there. We just didn't know because we didn't do genetic testing the same way.
Yeah, it's opened up a whole new
range of people finding
lots of areas.
Oh my gosh.
Like people not telling their now spouse that they donated sperm or eggs previously. And
or all the doctors who use their own sperm. Oh my, it's so many.
That's true.
I got to put a little shout out for the fact that, oh my gosh, that is not like modern good fertility clinic medicine. I still get patients that are worried about that. They're like, how do I know that it's going to be my partner's sperm? So there are so many levels of safety and checks, but it is scary to realize that those things did happen a while ago.
I do want to do a pitch. So on the front of protecting IVF, so there has been a federal bill introduced, the Right to Build Families Act, that was introduced on December 15th, 2022. And that is specifically intended throughout the country to protect the ability to access assisted reproductive technology. So to be very clear that any of these abortion-related laws should not infringe on your right to be able to engage in fertility services or to have the ability to determine what happens to your own genetic material, whether that be eggs, sperm, or embryos. So I don't know the chances, but for those who do believe in advocacy, having their voices heard, getting involved, I certainly recommend that you support Right to Build Families Act and organizations like Resolve that have advocacy days and help you kind of amplify your voice with legislators.
And personal stories are a really great way to do that, because you forget how a lot of people who are, making these decisions, they don't really understand what's involved in assistive technology. Again, the things that you hear in these stories, like being able to really personally explain why this is how you built your family and why it's so important, that really can make a big difference.
Well, that's what, we talked about with family equality with Shelby and Rebecca, is what that foundation was founded on was stories, because they're so powerful.
Absolutely. Just to tell an advocacy story. So in Colorado, we've had a number of pieces of legislation, and one of them was fighting for fertility insurance so that your insurance would cover fertility services and treatment. We went to this one hearing where we thought it'd be pretty split among, political lines, and person after person showed up telling their stories of selling their house, moving into their parents' basement to try to afford fertility treatments, parents planning on retiring but not retiring to try to help their children, to try to be able to have grandchildren in the future. And I mean, there were tears, and it was very, very moving to hear what people go through to try to have a family. And ultimately in that hearing, it was a unanimous vote in support of votes we did not expect to get, because people's individual stories do make a difference.
Washington State, we're in the middle of this. We have to yes. So that's, if you live in Washington right now, pay attention to where that law is.
Ooh, well, that was a lot. Scary, but ending on a hopeful note. I think you're right. I mean, the hard part is just uncertainty. And I feel like that's the challenge in so much of reproductive medicine, is how do you counsel about uncertainty? Because we can't predict the future.
Absolutely.
It's the hardest thing we do, at least in my opinion, as a provider, is trying to counsel about all the gray in this. And people are surprised at how much there really is. They're like, oh, ART, assisted reproductive technology, is so high tech. It should be like this and this. Like it should be, one way, but it totally isn't. There's so many factors and ethics that go into our field that you have to keep in the back of your head when you're counseling patients.
I know you and I know this, but it is terrifying. The number of judges who will be like, what's an embryo? They're like really basic questions where you're like horrified. And that's the situation we live in.
And how to make a decision on that if you're not really familiar with the science behind things and why we do what we do, certain things. And it comes back to the Dobbs decision too, for some of these things that are like, oh, if somebody has an ectopic pregnancy, you can't do anything. Like you can't just move the embryo. You cannot take it from the fallopian tube and put it in the uterus. But people don't know these. Our lawmakers don't know these things.
Terrifying. But the hope, the takeaway, talk to the professionals, talk to attorneys at the beginning. We do want to help. We want to help you understand your options and what you can do to protect yourself. And if you have the time and inclination, have your voice heard, advocate.
And if you have the time, go listen to I Want to Put a Baby in You to hear more of these stories.
Thank you. Yes,
and especially listen to the episode where we come on. So we will keep everybody posted.
Tuned.
Absolutely. And go in there and subscribe and give us both a 5-star review. We really go together better than Jerry Seinfeld and high-rise jeans.
Even better.
Thank you so much for coming back and spending this time with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.